whenever anybody who rises up suddenly in the digital world, it's going to get massacred. People just land on that person. If you have, like, for example, something suddenly goes viral, people start, who is that person? And they start finding out things. And there have been cases of people who have been broken by this. I mean, literally broken.
Hi, Martin. Thank you so much for coming here. You wrote the book Revolt of the Public, which I really love the topic of media. Let's start with, what's the main thesis around the book?
Number one, I'm happy to be here. Number two, the main thesis of the book is that much of what we think we know about our politics today is wrong. In other words, we tend to think in terms of liberal versus conservative, or left versus right, or some political party like Democrats versus Republicans. Whereas, in fact, in the last 20-some years, propelled by a tsunami of digital information that has battered basically a system that wasn't prepared for that amount of information. The two forces that seem to be determinative of our politics are, on the one hand, the public, a networked public that uses basically all those digital platforms to express itself, but also to organize and suddenly appear on the streets and protest. And the other side is the elites, who are essentially the people who manage the institutions that make modern life possible. Like, of course, there's government and there's politics, but corporations, the university, the media, for example, and the scientific establishment, nonprofit foundations, the whole list of top-down 20th century style institutions that is pretty much under assault from the public today. So, I mean, it's not like the old parties have disappeared, although they're very weak compared to what they used to be. And it's not like right and left is meaningless today. It's just that everything arrays itself around that basic tectonic collision between the public and the elites.
So you mentioned two parties, the public, which, assembles itself within this new platform, with the internet and maybe, and then you have the elites. But it seems that, whenever there is cancellation of people online and things like that, some people mention it, the mob came and, canceled an artist, or the mob came and did this or did that. Is there a difference between the mob, quote unquote, the mob, and the public that you mentioned in the book?
Yeah, I think the public, as it arose, and its first manifestation was the Arab Spring, where all of a sudden tens, hundreds of thousands of people showed up in places like Tahrir Square and many other countries around the Arabic-speaking world, that the people in charge had no idea who they were. They were keeping tabs. These were all very authoritarian regimes. They were keeping tabs on every group they considered to be subversive. These people didn't belong to any of those groups. They just organized online and showed up, okay? So, and that one can be seen to the characteristic of Tahrir Square, the crowd there, is you can spread to practically every protest that has happened, all the way to Black Lives Matter, what happened in the Capitol building on January 6th, same characteristics. Now, it all depends, I guess, on where you stand. If you're Hosni Mubarak, dictator of Egypt for 30 years, that probably looks like a mob to you, okay? But as I understand the mob to be today, we're talking about essentially the enforcement, the mailed fist of identity, right? In other words, there is a very powerful cult of identity today. Our institutions, our elites, have been converted to it for various reasons we can talk about. And part of part of the reason that identity appeals to the elites is because they have lost authority. They no longer can do what they used to do, which is just by the fact that they stood at the top of these pyramids, these institutions. People respected them, and people listened to them, and people pretty much were persuaded by they say. Now it's the opposite. If you stand at the top of these institutions, people despise you. People call you names. People contradict you constantly. You're being talked back constantly. So they have lost authority, but they think with identity, they can regain control. They can unleash the mob on the public. So in fact, the mob and the public stand on opposite ends, I would think, from the way that I see it anyway.
That's very interesting. And how, like, is there a common pattern between the public in different regions? Because you mentioned like different, scenarios, different countries, and even different, like completely separate parties, like completely opposite parties. Is there a common theme between the people within the public?
Yeah, it's very remarkable. Both the public and the elites exhibit these characteristics that carry from country to country almost identically, right? So the public, I suspect its characteristics are driven by digital culture. So the public, essentially, if you look at the crowd in Tahrir Square, it was composed on one extreme by very, extreme atheistic socialists. At the other extreme, you had the Muslim Brotherhood youth. The older guys stayed away, but the youth came to Tahrir Square, and everything in between. So if you went to the public and said, what is it you want to do? They would tell you 100 different things. They would start fighting with each other. Well, they were unified. They were unified in the purpose of overthrowing Hosni Mubarak. They were against. Every public arises out of being against, and they, like digital culture, don't have programs, don't have leaders, don't have ideology. In fact, they're anti-ideology. They proclaim themselves to be anti-political, anti-ideology. And you see that again and again and again. The indignados in Spain, you read their manifesto, they go, no, we belong to it. Every political strand, no political strand. Of course, the problem with that is, when you're always against and you refuse to say what you stand for, it tips over, or at least it threatens to tip over into what I call nihilism, which is, of course, the belief that destruction is a form of progress. If you think you can just batter something down and somehow you're doing good by that, but you're too different amongst yourself that you can't say, as in the 20th century, for example, anybody who took over, Fidel Castro taking over in Havana, a Lenin taking over in Moscow or St. Petersburg, had a group with a cohesive theory, a cohesive ideology, a desire for power, so they can impose programs derived from that ideology. None of that obtains with the public today. The public isn't even interested in power. It's a very strange thing. It looks on power, on government, as being essentially evil. So what it does is it protests. It says, you have all these evil traits. Then it turns to government and says, fix it, which is kind of unusual because you've just kind of demonized this institution and now you're somehow expecting it to fix it. That happens again and again and again. Whenever there's like an entry into politics, for example, the Tea Party, which were very much of a revolt of the public phenomenon, went into elections. And in Spain, the Indignados, a part of the Indignados became Podemos, which was a political party, and they went. I think they're now part of the ruling coalition. What happens is they lose their radical edge, and they just become slowly absorbed into the elites. So it's a very strange, very unusual similarity from country to country, rich countries, poor countries. dictatorship, people against dictatorship, people in democracy, it seems to make no difference.
Very interesting. So it seems that this type of movements already happened before in the past. So, we have Woodstock, now we have BLM protests, we have, in the 60s, we have the Martin Luther King, and then we had, George Floyd protests today. They are similar, they're different in nature, they're different in a few aspects. But are they essentially different, or are they the same, just happening again?
I think they're radically different. I think they're radically different. I mean, I think you are right in the sense that there's a rhythm to history, and it's, very inexplicable. It's not like you can mathematically predict when the next age, the age of troubles is going to happen. But there's no question there's a rhythm to history. If you're old as I am, you've already experienced a couple of cycles of everything, right? So, I mean, it feels to me today like I'm living in the 1970s all over again.
Yeah.
And I myself am a child of the 60s. So I never liked the 70s. But if you look, for example, the civil rights movement, that was very much what I'm talking about right now. That was a very organized system. These were very organized groups. They were, in their own way, much more benevolent, but structurally very much like the Bolsheviks or like, the revolutionary parties in Cuba. They wanted to influence, at least, if not take over government, to influence government, to change certain social aspects of the way we were living in those days by democratic legislation. They had a program, and it wasn't. It was successful. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1963, which was essentially embodied the program of the civil rights movement. There is no such thing today. Today, it's a much more vehement, much more angry, much more frustrated, and at the same time, much more incoherent attempt to smash at the system, to smash at the institutions, which have, have given reason for people to be upset with them. It's not like I'm denying that the institutions aren't failing. But normally in the 20th century, you would propose an alternative. This is what should be instead of what is now. Today, we're just saying, no, I hate what's happening. I don't like it. I don't like the people who are in charge. I don't like the institutions that are in charge. I don't like what they're doing. I don't like what they're saying. So what? What next? What's the change? And there isn't a programmatic approach to changing the standing institutions.
Very interesting. Do you think that that's caused because of the media itself that we're using? So what I mean by that is that right now it seems that these protests are, spread out virally through social media and the internet. And so you don't necessarily need to have a leader, as you mentioned. And before, I'm not too sure how they would spread, but they would have a leader. But also, it seems to me, and I may be wrong here, is that culturally, there is the U.S. has changed, for example. The world has changed. And so you mentioned about fighting an evil, right? It seems that at least before, I would think that people would think that there is evil within themselves and there's good within themselves. And right now they just think the evil is outside. There's no evil within them. So I wonder if, culturally, I think that that's the case. I may be wrong here, and I just want to hear your thoughts here and what's going on in there. Why there is that big difference?
Yeah, looking into people's heads and looking into culture, that's hard. So everything I want to say will be very speculative. I think the web is like it's a personal mirror. It's like a little narcissistic reflection where every time you get a follow or a like or you see your picture in there, it it gives you some kind of justification for being there, for living. Okay, um, I think also the digital culture, it has certain characteristics that are very similar to what I've been talking about with the public. Whenever anybody who rises up suddenly in the digital world is going to get massacred. The people just land on that person. If you have, like, for example, something suddenly goes viral, people start, who is that person? And they start finding out things. And there have been cases of people who have been broken by this. I mean, literally broken in the, not online, but in their own minds. So I 100% agree with what you said. It inspires us to kind of project everything outwards, to abolish introspection, abolish self-criticism, and just kind of assume that everything that we dislike is out there, and that we ourselves are free of blame. And I think, as a moral posture, that's just terrible. That's the worst you can be if you're a person like that. Many of us who are good human beings, normally, when we deal with our neighbors, go online and become horrible human beings. There's something structural about the medium that seduces people into acting in ways that they wouldn't have if you were talking to them face to face.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's something that I've been thinking a little bit more about it. One of the things that I've seen people mention is that whenever you're not, like, you don't put your person out, whenever you're not identifiable, you can portray yourself as the worst, because there's no consequences, right? And so you have a percentage of the population that might be narcissistic, might be a psychopath, and they can portray themselves in that way, and there are no consequences. If you portray yourself with your identity, then there are consequences to your acts. They can be either good or bad, but you at least think about it before you take action. But going to the media, and how things evolve mimetic, and before it wasn't as mimetic, means it didn't go as viral, right? How is that affecting institutions? We have it seems that the media and the government are losing public trust. Is that because they were always bad, or is there a change there? And how is the public reacting to that?
Yeah, I mean, good or bad are tricky words. I think our institutions were erected more or less along the course of the 20th century to deal with a 20th century information structure. The 20th century information structure was totally top-down, right? If you owned a newspaper, you had to have millions of dollars worth of plant and a distribution system. I couldn't just say, I'm going to start a newspaper today. You needed money. If you were on the radio, you needed a station. So the people who had access to studios or to newspaper plants basically were in charge of the information. But then all the other institutions had their own sources. Government had its own source of information. Obviously, the scientific establishment, the university had its own source, and there were no other outside sources. So you had authority by the mere fact that you had information in an environment that was a desert of information otherwise. So I feel that in essence, the 20th century political the rhetoric was utopian. You were told, we can solve your problems. It was a mathematical thing. Solve problems. We still talk that way. We talk about the problem of immigration. We solve like it's 2 + 2 = 4, right? I mean, that is just, we're talking about intractable conditions, not about problems, right? But that's a 20th century way of talking. We have these problems. We, as the elites, have, if you give us enough power, enough science, and enough money, can fix the human condition. So I think when we talk about good or bad, what happened, in fact, was we don't know as much as the 20th century thought it knew, all right? Human ignorance is a lot more profound, it turns out, and we now know than they were aspiring to. The experiment has been tried, it failed, okay? The problem is that mindset of saying we know sounds like you're being lied to. And I think to some extent that was probably true. But I think mostly it was, a belief that you could solve all social problems, all economic problems, all problems of equality and democracy. All you needed was, power, money, and wealth, and it could be done. And now that is being exposed as an impossibility. So it seems that we're being lied to. I think our elites today still talk that way, but have no belief that they can do any of those things anymore. They have a bad conscience about it. So they have converted the institutions into basically performative platforms. Something like CBS News, for example, formed. Yuval Levin in his book talks about formative versus performative, right? CBS News formed Walter Cronkite. It formed the way he spoke. It selected him, first of all. Then it formed him, the way he dressed, the words he used, the way he looked at the camera. All of that was very formative, right? Today it's performative. There are no Walter Cronkites. They're just people who use the institutions to strut. They strut their stuff. It's a personal brand, right? And so because they have lost the faith, the elites have lost any faith that they can change society in any way. They talk that way. They still promise that they're going to solve our problems, but none of them believe it. None of them believe it.
Interesting. So that begs a question. One of the things that I was thinking about when we were talking about the way the institutions were created in the past and right now, they are different, right? But if you look at the public sector here in the US and other regions, people say, oh, in other regions, they're better. And I've heard the comments that made me think about it. That was basically, look, the best people here in the US end up, like in tech, for example, they end up, working in tech firms, right? In France, for example, he was giving the example of France. Like in France, that person that he thought would work, in a top tech firm was working for the rail system. And that could explain part of it, why the differences in some areas here in the US and other region. And where I'm going there is that for institutions, it seems that a lot of the top people are going direct. So like if you think about newspapers, right? A lot of people are creating Substacks, which are, these newsletters that people send towards for podcasts. You have Joe Rogan, you have Russell Brand, you have all these personal brands that are going direct. And they can only win by competency, because if they're not good enough, they're not going to get enough audience, right? And it's just one person. On the case of newspapers, you had, people that used to work in the New York Times move out. So Barry Weiss, for example, that's one big example, right? Is the case that institutions were really this bad and we never seen, or the best people are leaving, or is it a combination of both? What's going on there?
No, I mean, I think the institutions were imperfect and selective. So if you looked at the New York Times through history, it has an awful record of, for example, misreporting. It misreported the famines and the persecutions in the Soviet Union under Stalin. Completely misreported this. The guy the reporter, forget what his name is now, but he got a Pulitzer Prize essentially for propagandizing on behalf of Stalin. They misreported what was happening in Cuba. They all did the same thing there. but at the same time, they always have conveyed some information. It was always, what is news? That's an interesting question. News is a series of topics of interest to the elites. If you think the newspapers were really information for you and me, it really wasn't. It was the elites conversing with one another, all right? So huge amounts of information about technology, for example, about philosophy, about the arts. Huge amounts of information were never even brought up. Politics was king, all right? So and that's for the people going, the best people going, doesn't really matter. The elites, the institutions are a big array. I have been to France. I know France pretty well, okay? The elites in France are as insufferable as the elites in the United States of America. and by the way, they say the exact same things. And yes, what you said is 100% right. The best and the brightest go into government or the government organizations, right? But look at the level of trust in France, and it's just as low as it is here. And you can get things like the yellow vests. I mean, one of the taxis in France, in Paris, used to be fun to ride because they always treated you like you were kind of a sad person because you weren't French. You know? They always condescended to you in a very interesting way because they felt like the French culture was so superior. In the last few years when I've gone to Paris, the taxi cabs have been terrible. They've been so angry that all they did was yell and scream about the situation, right? They're very angry, very angry. France is divided between a protected class, people, the elites and their clients. And the protected class is now on the streets in France demonstrating, by the way, because Macron is threatening to take away 2 years of their retirement from 62 to 64. And the non-protected classes, if you're a taxi cab driver, if you're a construction worker, if you are, a therapist who owns your own business, if you own a little store or a little marketplace, you don't retire at 62. You keep working because you have to pay your bills, all right? So it's a country that's very divided along the protected and the unprotected, the elites and the non-elites, the public. So, and it's true everywhere else. It just, every culture is different. But the elite and public divide exists in everyone.
I can tell you that the elites in Brazil are as insufferable as in the US, so I can relate there. So you talked a little bit more about the elites, right?
Yes.
How would you go about defining them? Because, you can think about the elite as the person that has a lot of money, but that's not necessarily, I would assume, right. Because, a farmer that contains a lot of farmland in the middle of the US, I don't think would be part of the elite. But someone that's, a writer for the New York Times that lives in a tiny apartment, they could be maybe considered part of the elite. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, as long as you are part of an institution, and the numbers vary that I've heard, 15, 30% of the population. You can, for example, if you are the lowest paid untenured professor at an prestigious university, and you're sitting in your little cafe drinking coffee and drinking your cappuccino, you feel infinitely superior to the owner of that cafe, who probably makes 3 times the amount of money you make, but he's not part of this great institution, the university, right? So there's a sense that comes with being attached to these institutions. I know I work for CIA. It's a powerful feeling, all right? It's a powerful feeling. So elites are essentially attached to institutions. That farmer would not be an elite because he's basically in business for his own, right? If he worked for a corporation, then he would be part of an elite because they would be part of that pyramid, that hierarchy that basically forces people into certain conformism and certain similarity in characteristics of how they look at the world. And so it's a pretty straightforward thing. All you got to do is listen. When you listen to somebody for about 3 minutes, you know right away, elite or not elite. Like I say, you could be in France or you could be in Vienna, Virginia, and it's the same words.
That's interesting. So we've seen the rise of big institutions. So you mentioned CBS. Maybe the CIA can be considered an institution. I'm not too sure about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. It's not. Also, you have the New York Times and all these other institutions. It seems to me that they've grown in size and power over time. So, like, if you think about big tech, for example, right? The big tech, they grow in size and power, and that doesn't mean that they grow in competence. To me, it's the reverse. But it seems that there is a trend towards, you are like having a smaller, either companies or smaller. It's not institution itself, but the person itself is portraying itself. So in media, we see, as I mentioned, Joe Rogan and Russell Brand, but we also see, Hollywood, quote unquote, is being dismantled. If you think about Mr. Beast, who is a YouTuber, he like spends millions of dollars in each video that he makes. He never went to Los Angeles. He lives in Hollywood, right? And he has a company at the end of the day. There are a bunch of people that support him, right? Are we seeing peak institutions? Like, are we at the peak of that? And is the trend towards going smaller, or are they going to fix themselves? Like, what do you think is going to happen, with these big institutions that, grew so much in influence and size, and there's so much, negativity towards them, right? Like so much negativity. Yep.
I mean, I would think some of them have grown, like government has grown, but not in size, but not in power. I think government today is far weaker than it used to be. I mean, a place like California, for example, which is a one-party state. I mean, basically, you would think that the government of California could do whatever it wanted. It has no opposition, but it can't build a bullet train, right? It has no power even to build a bullet train. It has no idea what to do with it. It has control, but it has no power, right? Some institutions like newspapers are not getting bigger. They're getting smaller and they're dying and they're going to die, okay? Big tech became big in the last 20 years. It was a very sudden thing. And they're now at a period of kind of like consolidation where they're being absorbed by the elites. And there's a struggle going on over that, because that also means that information is being controlled by the elites. And I think that's the battle that is being fought right now over, for example, Twitter files, all right? Then there are what you were mentioning, which to me are rays of hope. The Joe Rogans of the world, the Barry Wises of the world, people who are not yet institutions, but maybe at some point will become institutions that are counter to the trend that they're institutions of the digital world. All the other institutions I mentioned were institutions of the 20th century, of the industrial age, and had that shape and had that characteristic. These are people who are very savvy about the digital world, and the institutions they build will be digital institutions, which I think you are right, will be flatter and faster and more responsive, have more interaction with their audience than the old institutions. That is the nature of the web.
Very interesting, very interesting. One thing that you mentioned a little bit was, how these movements are, spread out through the internet and things like that. One thing that caught my attention was like the BLM protest happened in London. It happened in Brazil, I think. And I would imagine this is more a movement that should happen more in the US because it was US based. But it happened over the world, right? And if look at it, there are like memes and viral videos and movements, viral movements that go over, the whole globe. The question is like how how long, or I guess, how long are these, movements last? Like, are they like long lasting? Or even, even if you think about memes, right? There are memes that, like, there are images that, last just, a few days, but there are also memes that last a long time, right? There is one meme that I really like, that's the bell curve that, shows the different, like the very smart person and the very dumb person, they believe the same thing. And then what we call the mid-tweets, they have a very complicated explanation of what's going on. But like, there are memes that last a long time, but there are viral memes and viral movements that last a few moments. Are all the movements gonna last the amount that, a meme lasts, just like very fast, or are there gonna be movements that are last long, like memes?
Good question. On the one side, I have, one of the things I would love to do at some point is do an analysis of memes and really deep dive into memes. I haven't done it, so I'm not going to say much about what you just said. But with regards to the movements, well, go back to what I said before. If you have nothing in the way of an ideology, leadership, organization, programs, how can you last other than as a bunch of slogans? And of course, the web is, with memes, it's a gigantic factory of slogans. It just spews out slogans. So Black Lives Matter. What changed? What changed on the ground? Who were they? They were, the people who actually started the movement were 2 or 3 women in San Francisco, I believe. All of whom, by the way, have been discredited because of financial scandals or whatnot. But they weren't. They started it. But the thing about online movements is that they take on a life of their own, and they survive as slogans and so forth. But and they can, for a while, put many people on the streets. But it wasn't even the difference was there wasn't even like the civil rights movement, which had a very defined legislative agenda, equality. There was, I'm old enough, and when I came to the state of Virginia, it was segregated. Okay, it lasted only a year or two. I was in high school when it ended, but that was the very clear political agenda and social agenda was there was a whole segment of the American population that was not being treated the way the Constitution says you're supposed to be treated. That's pretty straightforward, right? So what was Black Lives Matter about? Cops shooting or killing Black people? You can discuss that over and over again. Cops kill a lot of people, and that's probably a good conversation to have. White, Black, and everything. Black people have the highest murder rate of any group in the United States. That should be probably a subject for discussion. But what happened in the end, the only effect that the protests have was to have police forces all over America in the urban centers just withdraw. And when the police withdraw, it's intuitive. What happens when the criminals advance? So there is no poll, opinion poll of the Black population that I have seen that favors defunding the police. None. They are the ones that depend on protection the most. They have the highest murder rate. So what did it achieve? I don't know. Nothing much. And the word is maintained, and because racial relations in this country are so strange, you are not allowed to say certain things, such as maybe a whole lot of this was just emotion and outrage, but not very constructive. I would say that these revolts by and large dissipate. Where are the Hong Kong protesters today? Where are the indignados today? Every once in a while, I will add, they win big. And what happens? Okay, Chile was one of my favorite case studies, right? Chile was a prosperous, democratic country, and suddenly, over a few pennies of addition to mass transit costs, there was this protest that exploded. Many died, millions of dollars of losses. There were elections, and essentially a lifetime protester, a young guy, 35 years old, won the election for president. There was an election for a new constitution. They won basically the protesters all won the majority in the constitutional group. They came up with a constitution that had 200 pages. It was this gigantic tome that basically granted everybody lots of rights, but it had no way of reconciling how this group was going to get more than that group, or where the money was going to come from, or how you govern in such a way. So even in Chile, where the protesters won everything, there's now this sense of, so what do we do? What is it that we intended to do? And when you ask them what they intended to do, they come up with a 200-page mess, a mess. So yes, even in a place like that, they come and they go and they dissipate.
Interesting. That made me think a little bit about what's going on in the US, and it feels to me that we're in a transition time. Like whenever there was the printing press was created, religion changed a bit,
yes.
right? And
yes.
so you had this big institution at the top that was maybe corrupt. And then, people didn't like that, and they realized that it was very corrupt. It seems that we're in a similar time period whereas, you have these institutions that are somehow corrupt, and then you have the people fighting back. And then you have these weird movements every now and then, very viral movements, but in the long run, it might be the case that we get better. One example that I like to think about is the Iraq War, right? The Iraq War, it was basically, it seems that it was started by a lie. It was like, weapons of mass destruction. I wonder what would have happened if the Iraq War started at this time around, if people would, people in Iraq would post selfies and in the desert saying, "Oh, look, there are enough weapons of mass destruction here" on Twitter, and reply, to whatever president.
Well, that's an interesting speculation. I can tell you though, my personal belief is the Iraq War was not started by a lie. It was started by a mistake. I was inside CIA. CIA firmly believed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So it was, again, pretending to know what we didn't really know. But they thought they knew. They were acting as if, and they believed that they knew. They believed that they knew. They just didn't. So I think today that would be exposed as, and you're right. Whenever the government makes a mistake, it is almost never interpreted by the public as incompetence. It's interpreted as corruption and deceit, right?
Yeah.
So I can tell you 90% of what happens in government is not massive conspiracies and lies. It's just people thinking they know who have no clue what really is going on.
Yeah, that's a good point. But there is a movement against incompetence, right? Like there is a movement against, the government, for example, going to wars every 4 years, like this massive government, and there is some fight back. And maybe we're in a bumpy road right now, and it's like new media and it's a new kind of information flow, and we don't really know how to use it. But do you think that institutions like government can improve because now there is this feedback loop against making wrong decisions or making decisions like that?
There is no feedback loop. Not if you're at the top. If you're an elite, you don't consider it a feedback loop. You consider it a bunch of crazy people who don't know what they're talking about, trying to tell you what to do. However, I think in the past in this country, we have changed our institutions. We have radically changed. I can tell you this. If Thomas Jefferson rose from the grave and took a look at the federal government today, he would jump back in his grave and never come out again, okay? They look nothing like what he thought he got way back when the framers of the Constitution finished their work, okay? We changed our government from essentially a gentleman's republic to a mass system of organization in the 20th century. That's the system that is now obsolete, okay? We can change it again to a digitalized form of government, which would be flatter and faster and more responsive and would have a feedback loop because that's the nature of the digital world. We need to, first of all, consciously, with intent, reconfigure the government. It's not going to happen by itself. And honestly, we need to get rid of the crowd we have there now of elites because those people don't want to do that. It is too uncomfortable for them. The 20th century elites were comfortable. They were up here talking and nobody talked back. 21st century elites is miserable. Everybody talks back, right? So they want to take us back the other way. They are reactionary. So until we get rid of this crowd, and maybe in part that will happen generationally, but we need more than that. We need also a change in the mindset, almost the moral makeup of the elites, so that they understand, as you and I understand, that they don't have to tell us that they can do things we know they cannot do, right? They don't have to pretend that inequality is a mathematical problem that they can solve, or that the economy is another problem that it's easy for them to, the solution to unemployment, that here it is. We don't have to be told this. We just have to be told what is it that they think is best for any given situation we want to change. And also have humility and the integrity to be modest and the courage to accept failure sometimes, right? Like in tech, people accept failure. And truly in science, in true science, people accept failure. When in a truly healthy institutional frameworks, failure is part of the process. In politics today, you cannot fail. So the most disastrous policy, you desperately have to pretend it's a success, right? I mean, Joe Biden called the catastrophe in Afghanistan a success. Yet you cannot say otherwise. So we have basically all these changes have to be instituted intentionally. They're not going to happen of themselves.
Interesting. So you mentioned how debates are fighting back. And that brings me to censorship, right? It seems that, especially with big tech, you have these elites that are what some people call the managerial class, or they're the laptop class, which I may be part of it, but because I'm in tech, even though I wouldn't like to be part of this, blah, but it seems that, there is some fight back with the information flow. So, you mentioned the Twitter files and, there was censorship with the New York Post, and, Twitter has now been completely now Elon Musk, who would be considered as elite, but he somehow is not because he talks normally to people. He's, a weird character, is showing, how they were all colluding to, I would imagine, to fight back. Is this censorship gonna work? And, what's gonna happen there here in the US and elsewhere?
I think that's the most important political question we're facing today. Without a doubt, I think that. I think right now we're in a moment of struggle, and we're in a moment where previous attempts at controlling the information environment have been revealed by Twitter files, right? By Elon Musk taking over Twitter and then turning over what had been going on in there to people like Barry Weiss and Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi, who brilliantly have exposed this web between elites. I mean, the thing you have to realize is these are all the same people. There were dozens of FBI people who moved to work at Twitter. So when the FBI was telling Twitter, you should not be, tweeting about this laptop of Hunter Biden's because that's a Russian hack. The people at Twitter were the same people as the FBI thought the same thoughts. Like I said, the characteristics are the same. So it showed that because the defense that was always being given of social media was these are private entities. The First Amendment doesn't apply to them. In other words, Facebook is Mark Zuckerberg's sandbox, and if he wants to kick you out, he has every right to do so, right? Yeah. But now with Twitter Files, we know that's not the case. Now we know it's been the government behind the scenes telling these companies, this is the content you should allow. This is the content you should silence and mute. These are the people you should give, a great stage for. These are the people that you need to bounce out of and these companies have accepted that, and they have accepted it not because they were told they had to do it, but because the elite mindset is conformistic and they believed in the same things as the government, but they were doing it at the instance of the government. That becomes, by definition, a First Amendment issue and censorship. All right. But if Mark Zuckerberg doesn't like what I say and boots me out of Facebook, that's not censorship. That's Mark Zuckerberg being the boss. All right. If the government tells Mark Zuckerberg, get Gurri out of Facebook because we don't like what he's saying, and Mark Zuckerberg obeys, that's censorship.
And what happens in the U.S. legally when the First Amendment is not followed? Like,
well, you usually end up going to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court takes a very large club and hits the company or the government over the head and says, you are not allowed to do this sort of thing. And I suspect that's going to happen sooner or later, but it takes a long time. Right now, it's a political fight. It's not a legal fight. It's a political fight. You basically have to show to the door office holders who believe they ought to control content. That is part of somehow the government's role to suggest heavily remember that Joe Biden said about social media that they were killing people. Those are the words he used. They were killing people because of COVID, right? The things that were allowing of COVID. So, I mean, if you are Mark Zuckerberg or the head of any of these companies, and the president of the United States is saying you're killing people, you're going to do what the government says in the end. And they just spread that to politics. My belief is right now it's a political fight. I believe what happens in the United States is the people who don't believe in censorship ought to be elected. And I'm not a partisan. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I am what Barry Wise calls politically homeless. Okay. But you decide who these people are, but the people who do not believe in censorship should be elected, and the people who have tried to install the system of backroom control. And why haven't we known that this has been happening? Because these people have a bad conscience. They knew perfectly well what they were doing, right? They were not saying we are now going to talk to these companies. These were all secret meetings, right? They were backdoor meetings of the kind that Americans don't like. So we're being controlled behind our backs in an informational sense by governments and corporations that are basically just shaking hands and say, yeah, let's face it, it's better if that laptop were a Russian hack, if that story were a Russian hack, than if it really was a laptop from the son of the candidate for the Democratic Party saying all these horrible things and doing all this scandalous stuff going on. And, it worked. Social media went with that story. The government, the retired people from CIA, from FBI, 51 of them signed this document saying it was a Russian hack. The newspapers and the news media treated it like a Russian hack. There you have it. It's a Russian hack. We need to basically throw out the people who perpetrated that hoax.
Interesting. Yeah, I find it funny that the explanation was a Russian hack. Why not a Chinese hack or whatever else country hack? Like, it's just like whatever the enemy of the past. They're using the enemy of the past as an explanation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's because that crowd, the elites, actually admire China very much. They hate Putin because he's just like a slovenly authoritarian, but they admire China because that's the ideal in the minds of our elites is China, I think, in many ways. And I mean, you saw that with COVID. I mean, Anthony Fauci was saying there's not going to be a lockdown. The Chinese locked down literally 2 weeks after he had said there was not going to be a lockdown. He said we're locking down. I think there is a great deal of admiration for China, but when did Putin become such a genius? I mean, and by the way, where was that genius when he invaded Ukraine? I mean, the information war in Ukraine was won by Zelensky in the first hour of that conflict. All right, all these brilliant Russian hacks, all these brilliant Russian election manipulators. Where were they? You know? Yeah. So that's another question.
That's since you have a little bit more experience, was there some kind of like? So I think China is in my personal view, I think China is in a similar point as USSR. Like it's this big like homologous, dictatorship that it's like putting like Xi Jinping is basically controlling. But if you look at the roots of it, it's all rotten. Like the financial system is completely over leveraged. Their society is basically collapsing because they had a one-child policy. Their One Belt, One Road is a bunch of loans that are never going to be repaid. They're all losing money. It seems all like a rotten structure. I wonder, like, if USSR, in the 70s or 80s was in a similar place where the elites saw, oh, look, USSR is like this amazing country, and it's actually a superpower, and we should imitate or we admire. Was that the case, or is it different now and then?
Yeah, I mean, practically to the dying day of the USSR, there were people in this country who thought it was a model to be followed. Not in everything, obviously. Nobody liked the dictatorship part, but the fact, for example, that it had zero unemployment, it was a rational employment system. I mean, that was practically to the dying day of the USSR. People were going there and seeing wonderful things. I don't think it's quite parallel with China. China does have a gigantic private sector that is very, very lusty and healthy. I do believe they're going in the wrong direction. And I am old enough. I think the parallel might be more with Japan or with the USSR. I'm old enough to remember when Japan was going to overtake the United States and become the largest economy in the universe. And look at Japan now. It's flatlined for a generation, right? And I think China it's better than that at the moment, but it's headed that way. I think China has all those structural problems that you listed are serious problems. It's hard to have a one-party totalitarian system manage a cowboy capitalistic economy. How does that happen? I can always ask that, and I think we're finally coming to the point where the question is serious, And I think Xi has decided he would rather have, the totalitarian system than the capitalistic economy. But the only legitimacy that system has had, because nobody believes in Marxism anymore, is prosperity. So if he kills prosperity, as he has done with his crazy zero COVID policy, and that's may well be impacted as well by the one-child policy that now is coming home to roost. If they lose that huge momentum of prosperity, the party's going to find itself in trouble. And by the way, as we saw, I was always told there can never be protests in China because the Chinese government is so clever. The Chinese government had, they're all over the web and they know who's who, and they have all these spies inside the web, and people were coming out and yelling, get rid of Xi, get rid of this system. It's terrible. Bring us a better system, because they were so desperate about the zero COVID policy. And what happened? What happened? On a dime, that policy turned and what ended. That tells you one of two things. Either Xi was terrified and went the other direction, or there are people in that government who still can make him do what he doesn't want to do. So either way, that's interesting.
Question. So with USSR, like it seems that, at least to me, that China is in a turning point, economically and financially and politically, and they might see the economy not grow as fast as they saw in the past, and that can cause turmoil. How usually governments react to that? How, for example, USSR reacted to that? Do they become more aggressive? Do they try to invade other countries? Or like how does it usually work with governments?
Yeah, I think it varies. I think in the USSR, no, the USSR underwent a process of just senility. All right, basically senility. It was run by people in their 80s, and the people in their 80s are not about to go on overseas adventures. Mm-hmm. So in that case, it got old, and then they got a young guy in Gorbachev, and Gorbachev basically broke everything. He was young and energetic and started changing things, and the system just collapsed, okay? On the other hand, the generals in Argentina had a terrible economic situation, were totally unpopular, and they invaded the Malvinas, as they like to call the Falkland Islands, conquered the Malvinas for about 3 days, and for about 3 days were the most popular government that Argentina had ever seen, right? Then Margaret Thatcher came and booted them out, and that was the end of that government. It was a desperation move, and it failed. China, that's a good question. China stands somewhere between those two. I don't know. The answer is I don't know. My gut sense, but I don't have any inside information, is that the Chinese ruling elites, the ruling class, is painfully aware of how fragile that system is, and would only go on an overseas adventure, invade Taiwan, say, as a total desperation move, knowing that failure would mean the end of the system, the end of the regime. So that's my guess, but I don't have any inside information.
Interesting. It seems that also in the past we had centralization of institutions, and that portrayed itself, for example, in architecture. So one example that I mentioned in the book is Brasilia, which is the capital of Brazil. It's like this communist heaven, like modernist, that, you drive around and like there are no public spaces and things like that. With now media, we actually have some sort of globalization. It seems that, things spread out globally. So ideas spread out globally, but also, maybe architecture also spread out globally. So if you look at, London, New York, Hong Kong, Amsterdam, or Brussels, and, Sao Paulo, if you go to the center of the city, they all look the same, right? What do you think is going to happen with, information flow? And how is that going to affect people's lives? Are we going to have more globalization, meaning like we're going to have more of the same? Or are we going to start reverting to the back to the mean, meaning, each region has its own cultural influences, its own cultural architecture. And, I think architecture basically portrays how society is at the moment. But like, how do you think that's going to happen, with the internet and social media?
That's a good question. I think culture is powerful. And although it will be changed by the globalizing impulse of the internet, it will retain Chinese culture. Is not going to be American culture. It's not going to be French culture. It's not going to be Italian culture. Okay. And so everything will be changed. There'll be a mutual changing The internet will change the culture will change the internet. Okay. I think one of the things that has changed and is remarkable to me, history is my favorite thing, is something that you and I both are examples of, okay? The incredible spread of the English language. You were born in Brazil. I was born in Cuba. Here we are both speaking in English. I remember distinctly, this was quite a while back. I'm thinking, I don't know, early 00s, being in Italy, my favorite country in the world, in the Piazza del Popolo in Siena, one of my favorite places in Italy, me and my wife watching an Italian waiter and a German man with a little dog speaking in English at each other, right? I mean, the two of them, these are two countries that are adjacent to one another, but they were both speaking in English. And that was a long time ago. Now it's much more, I mean, speaking English has become, I don't think it has ever been there has never been a language, Latin, Mandarin, there has never been a language ever in history that has spread as far as English has because of the web. Now, how much that changes, it makes obviously American and Anglosphere cultural influence very powerful because everybody can speak the language or at least understand it. But how much that changes other cultures, I'm not really sure. That's a really good question.
It's interesting. I was talking to my brother about this, and like we're talking about different languages and how Americans learn a second language, and to me it seems that the elites now try to teach their kids Mandarin, thinking, "Oh, China is going to be the future," and I'm like, they already know English; they can speak to anyone. Like why? Like I don't think Chinese is going to be that important. And second, like they can speak English, but
and also, by the way, they should teach English. They teach English badly because among the many things that have happened is, for example, much of the literature of the English literature, which I think is the greatest in the world, is now under the ban because it's white males writing, so we're not to pay attention to that. So the greatest literature in the world is sort of marginalized. So when you listen to the younger generation talk, sometimes they sound like they've learned English as a foreign language.
That's funny. That was a great conversation, Martin. I really, really appreciate your time. It was like really interesting. I've learned a lot. I think our viewers are going to learn a ton as well. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It was fun.